Did you know there was a time in New York where farmers dressed as Native Americans to fight rent? No, seriously, this wasn't some colonial fever dream. This was the anti-rent war, and it was messy, absurd, and somehow involved a dead feudal lord, pitchfork mobs, and 1,800 seconds cosplay. Let's go back, not to the Wild West, to upstate New York. It's the early 1800s. America's doing its post-revolution victory lap, but in New York, there's a secret kingdom, a leftover relic from Dutch colonial days called the Rensselaer Manor. It's not small. This land spans over 800,000 acres, basically a miniature country. It's run by one guy, Stephen van Rensselaer III. People literally called him the Good Patroon, because yeah, patroon was still a thing. A patroon was a feudal landlord who owned all the land, while tenant farmers paid rent to work it, like medieval Europe. But in New York, Van Rensselaer wasn't just rich, he was absurdly rich, like owns a good chunk of New York rich, but he was also chill, kind of. He let his tenants slide on rent when times were tough. He kept things casual, basically pay me when you can. That worked until he died. And his heirs were like, hey, time to collect all that back rent. Thousands of farmers suddenly owed decades of rent, like generational debt, and they weren't having it, especially because the rent wasn't even in dollars, it was in bushels of wheat, livestock, or days of unpaid labor. Feudalism, full blast. The farmers tried legal routes, petitions, letters. The courts shrugged. So the farmers said, cool, let's rebel. And that's when things got spicy. Groups of tenant farmers organized across the Hudson Valley. They dressed in disguise, often as Native Americans, calling themselves the Calico Indians. It wasn't cultural appropriation in the modern sense. It was intimidation theater. They'd paint their faces, wear animal pelts or patchwork outfits, and ambush rent collectors. They'd hold mock trials, tear up eviction papers. Sometimes they'd tar and feather tax agents. It was basically guerrilla theater mixed with riot season. The anti-renters developed signals, whistles, horns. They'd light fires on hilltops to signal an incoming attack. Rent collectors were terrified. Sheriffs wouldn't go near the place. One tax man said it felt like being dropped into the lair of wild beasts. These weren't just farmers anymore. They were an organized resistance. Then came 1844. The sheriff of Delaware County tried to arrest an anti-rent leader named Smith Abouten, aka Big Thunder. Yes, his nickname was Big Thunder. Naturally, the Calico Indians mobilized. They blockaded roads, they fought off deputies. At one point, they outnumbered state troops. Eventually, the governor had to call in the militia, the real militia, with guns. Big Thunder was arrested, along with dozens of others. Some got long prison sentences. A few were sentenced to death, but public opinion? Totally with the rebels. People saw the anti-renters as folk heroes, Robin Hoods in flannel. The movement got political. Anti-renters formed their own party. They backed candidates who promised to break up the patroon system. And in 1846, boom, they got what they wanted. The New York Constitution was amended. It banned feudal leases, outlawed the rent system, and declared that all land contracts had to be in money, no more wheat, chickens, or labor IOUs, the great feudal experiment. In New York? Dead. So what's the legacy? Well, the anti-rent war is one of the only times in U.S. history that tenant farmers successfully rose up against a landed elite. And won. It was cosplay rebellion, it was political theater, and it worked. Imagine if landlords today tried charging you rent in goats, you'd lose your mind. But back then, people did lose their minds in the form of full-blown rebellion. History forgot this one. But the next time you complain about rent, remember, someone in 1845 put on war paint, screamed, "I am Big Thunder," and kicked a sheriff off their porch with a pitchfork. That's real, that happened, and it worked. So you just watched farmers in New York go full Robin Hood, face paint, disguises, pitchfork justice, the whole thing? But what happened after the anti-rent war? Did the rebels go back to farming? Did Big Thunder retire into legend? Did landlords just vanish? Not quite, because part 2 of the anti-rent war? It's about politics, prison breaks, and the long, weird hangover of feudalism in America. First off, Big Thunder, real name Smith Abouten, the guy who helped kick this whole rebellion into overdrive. He was sentenced to life in prison. Yeah, life. The courts wanted to make an example. Rebellion is bad. Face paint is illegal. No more thunder, big or otherwise. But guess what? In 1847, just a few years later, New York pardoned him. Public opinion had shifted. People didn't see Big Thunder as a criminal. They saw him as a folk hero, a martyr of the working class. So he walked out of jail, back into the hills, basically like an outlaw turned legend. Meanwhile, the anti-renters weren't done. They had political momentum. They formed the anti-rent party, started endorsing candidates, and even won seats in the state legislature. Yes. These dudes who used to throw flaming pitchfork parties in the woods were now wearing suits in Albany, and they delivered. In 1846, the New York Constitution was rewritten. It banned long-term feudal leases, it limited landlord powers, and it enshrined protections for tenant farmers. Revolution, legalized. So the rebels had won, kinda. Landlords were losing power, tenant farmers were voting, Big Thunder was free, but the war? It didn't end, it just changed its costume. Behind the scenes, old landowning families were still trying to claw their way back into power. They started selling off their land contracts to lawyers and debt collectors, not the land itself, just the right to collect rent on it. They called them heirs to the manors. You'd get companies in New York City who didn't own a single blade of grass, but would show up in Albany County demanding rent payments from people who'd been there since George Washington. They'd say, hey, your great-great-granddad signed a lease in 1787, pay up, and guess what? Some judges let them enter rent trolls. No, not internet trolls. These were real people who bought up old leases like lottery tickets. They'd spend pennies on old paperwork and then sue modern homeowners for thousands. Imagine buying your family farm, only to find out someone 200 years ago owed rent to a long-dead baron. And now you have to pay it? It happened, a lot. These guys became known as speculators, a polite word for people profiting off legal necromancy. Then came the foreclosure waves. Some families who thought they'd won the anti-rent war lost their land decades later, all because of loopholes, fine print, technicalities in dusty 18th century documents. The rebellion was fire and war paint, the counterattack. Lawyers with briefcases and time, and while that was happening, the manors just evolved. They rebranded as real estate companies. Investment trusts, historical land associations, new name, same game. They sold pieces of land with weird clauses tucked in, things like, you can own the land, but you owe $1 a year in peppercorn rent, you can't grow corn here, you have to let descendants of the landlord hunt deer on your property. Yes, some contracts literally included the phrase a buck and a doe on demand. By the 1900s, most of these manorial leftovers were finally outlawed. New York passed more reforms, land ownership modernized, feudalism was mostly buried, but some cases still in court as late as 2004. That's right, over 150 years later. Families were still fighting lawsuits over fake medieval rent claims, and here's the kicker, all of this. The rebellions, the prison sentences, the political party, the lawsuits, the centuries of battles over goats and land. It barely shows up in most US history books. It gets maybe a paragraph right between Erie Canal and potato famine, but this war, it shaped property law, tenant rights, and grassroots organizing across America. The anti-rent war didn't end, it just faded into the background, waiting for someone to dig it up again, put on the face paint, and tell the story right. So after all the face paint, the midnight cowbell mobs, the courtroom drama, and the legal whiplash that lasted into the 2000s, what are we left with? Well, here's the thing. The anti-rent war was technically a failure. The manors didn't fall overnight. No tyrant got dragged out of a castle. No fireworks exploded over Albany. But it was one of the first times in American history that poor people organized, said no, and actually changed the law. Before this, if you were a tenant farmer in the 1800s, you had no power, no vote, no land, no chance. After this, there was a crack in the wall, a legal precedent, a legacy of resistance, proof that torch-wielding farmers in upstate New York could make the government blink. It laid the groundwork for rent control laws, tenants' unions, modern zoning reforms, and the idea that landlords are not gods. Even today, when people fight for housing justice, they're pulling on a thread that started with a group of farmers in 1845 wearing dresses and deer masks. So next time you hear about a rent strike or a protest over gentrification or some local election where zoning becomes the issue, just remember, Big Thunder's spirit lives on. In every no shouted at a corrupt landlord, in every courtroom where the little guy shows up with receipts, in every bonfire that reminds the rich they don't own the whole damn world. The anti-rent war ended on paper, but the real fight? It never left. You're just in the latest chapter, and if history tells us anything, the landlords should probably still be nervous.